A quote from St. John Henry Newman. "The great universe itself, moral and material, sensible and supernatural, cannot be gauged and meted by even the greatest of human intellects." Hello, and welcome to the Disputed Questions Podcast, Episode 1. My name is Harrison, and in this episode we're going to begin discussing the categories of Aristotle. This is the first full episode of the podcast. The previous episode, which I called Episode 0, was an introduction to myself and to the podcast as a whole. So, if you haven't listened to that episode yet, it's probably a good idea to do so before continuing with this one, so that you'll have a good idea of what we're doing and what this podcast is all about. Also, before we begin, I must apologize up front for the fact that we won't actually be getting to the text of the categories in this episode. Instead, in this episode, I'll be giving introductory material to the work before we start reading it in the following episode. This was not my original intention at all, and I don't expect it to be the normal format for other texts. But, as you'll see, the Categories is a particularly difficult text which really demands a good deal of background context and information in order to be properly understood. Okay, so with that having been said, let's go ahead and get started. Aristotle's Categories is one of the most fundamental works in all of philosophy, and also one of the most heavily debated. In this episode, we're going to frame our discussion of the work around 5 basic questions: what, who, when, where, and why. First, the what. The Categories is a short work by Aristotle which is part of the Organon, the traditional collection of Aristotle's logical works. The work presents the famous 10 categories of Aristotle, which have had an enormous influence on the development of philosophical thought throughout the past 2 millennia. That is the basic answer to the question of what. Next we turn to the question of who. We've said already that the Categories is attributed to Aristotle, but who was Aristotle? Allow me here to introduce the master of those who know, as Dante called him, the man to whom St. Thomas Aquinas gave the title of simply the philosopher. Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher who lived in the 4th century BC. Frederick Copleston writes, quote, "Aristotle was born in 384 or 383 BC in Stagira in Thrace, and was the son of Nicomachus, a physician of the Macedonian king." End quote. Stagira was, as Christopher Shields notes, a small city in the Macedonian region of northeastern Greece. It is as a result of his origins here in the city of Stagira that Aristotle came to be called the Stagirite. But Aristotle did not remain in Stagira too long. Copleston continues, quote, "When he was about 17 years old, Aristotle went to Athens for purposes of study and became a member of the Academy in 368 or 367 BC, where for over 20 years he was in constant intercourse with Plato until the latter's death in 348 or 347 BC." End quote. The Academy was the famous school founded by Plato at Athens, devoted to intellectual study, discussion, and teaching. According to Copleston, quote, "The Academy may rightly be called the first European university, for the studies were not confined to philosophy proper, but extended over a wide range of auxiliary sciences." End quote. Plato founded the Academy after the death of his own mentor, Socrates, who, in his life, teaching, and death, had had a tremendous effect on his young pupil. And, as Socrates was to Plato, so Plato was to Aristotle. And we have in this trio of master-student relations, each a pillar of Western philosophy, a phenomenon so profound, so unique, that its impact on the whole history of thought is nearly unparalleled. And so it is no exaggeration to say that Aristotle was one of the greatest philosophers and most influential thinkers in history. This is indeed precisely what the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states. Quote, Aristotle numbers among the greatest philosophers of all time. Judged solely in terms of his philosophical influence, only Plato is his peer. Aristotle's works shaped centuries of philosophy, from late antiquity through the Renaissance, and even today continue to be studied with keen, non-antiquarian interest." End quote. After Plato's death, Aristotle left the academy at Athens. At one point, he was asked by Philip of Macedon to tutor his young son Alexander, the very same Alexander who is known to us as Alexander the Great. Later, Aristotle would return to Athens and start his own school, known as the Lyceum. He died in 322 BC. This is an outline of Aristotle's life, but we should say something also concerning the scope and content of his philosophical thought. We noted above that Plato's academy was not confined in its curriculum of study to what we would consider philosophy proper, but extended its interests over a broad range of sciences. This is true for Plato and his school, but it is true to a much greater extent for Aristotle. Aristotle, more so than perhaps any other early Greek thinker, was a master of an extraordinarily wide range of subjects. As Christopher Shields puts it, quote, "His writings are broadly cast, arrestingly deep, and coursing with curiosity. The works we possess today range widely across an astonishing number of fields, including aesthetic theory, argumentation theory, astronomy, botany, biology, category theory, cosmology, epistemology, ethics, government, history of thought, literary theory, logic, mathematics, metaphysics, music, medicine, meteorology, pedagogy, philosophy of science, political theory, psychology, physics, rhetoric, semantic theory, political history, theology, and zoology. All these areas Aristotle pursued with genuine, unself-conscious zeal under a general rubric of his own invention." End quote. Think of how this extremely broad array of study contrasts to the intellectual climate of today, where an excessively high degree of specialization is the norm, and where it is seemingly impossible to have even a cursory knowledge of several distinct subjects, let alone to master such subjects. This accomplishment is all the more astounding given the fact that, for many of the fields listed above, Aristotle's work would be both foundational and authoritative for centuries. Shields also notes that, quote, "Aristotle distinguishes three broad categories of inquiry. The first class is theoretical, comprising disciplines pursuing knowledge for its own sake. The second is practical, including ethics, politics, and all study concerned with conduct and goodness in action, whether individual or societal. And the third is productive, covering those sciences and crafts which aim at the creation of beautiful or useful objects, broadly conceived so as to include drama and dance." End quote. Shields lists several works which correspond to each of these three categories of thought. To mention a few of the most well-known here, we might point to the Physics and Metaphysics in the class of theoretical works, the Nicomachean Ethics in the Politics and the Practical class, and the Rhetoric and Poetics in the Productive. As Shields also points out, there has been controversy since ancient times about where exactly the logical works of Aristotle fit into the above classificatory scheme, but that is not a question we will deal with here. In terms of doctrine, Aristotle is well known for his divergence from and contrast to his teacher Plato. This difference is to a certain extent well captured in the famous image of these two thinkers in Raphael's masterpiece, The School of Athens. This painting depicts Plato and Aristotle as standing side by side, with the former pointing directly upwards and the latter seeming to motion downwards. According to its common interpretation, this is meant to represent the central distinction between the philosophies of these two intellectual giants. Plato is pointing upwards towards the heavens because, in his philosophy, what is most real are the eternal forms or ideas which exist on their own in a transcendent realm, and the physical world of sensible things is a mere shadow or copy of the heavenly, divine, purely intelligible world. On the other hand, Aristotle is motioning downwards, because in his philosophy the forms do not exist separately or independently of particular sensible things, but instead are in these things, which things are accordingly not mere shadows or copies, but are distinct, complete realities in their own right, at least to a certain extent. This fundamental distinction in metaphysical outlook then affects the entire focus and method of the two schools of thought. Plato's focus, to put things somewhat simplistically, is on the universal, the abstract, the divine, while Aristotle's is on the earthly, the particular, the empirical. The one aims at the world of pure thought, the other at the world of experience and observation. On this account of things, Plato is much more religious and mystical, while Aristotle is more scientific and practical. This general overview is not without truth, although it must be emphasized that it is a simplification of their doctrines and an exaggeration of their differences. It is correct that Aristotle locates the forms in particular sensible things, and it is also correct that Aristotle possesses a more empirical and practical bent than his master. But it is incorrect to thereby infer that Aristotle had no interest in the abstract, the universal, or the divine, or that he had nothing in him of the religious and metaphysical inclinations of Plato. As Copleston states, quote, Aristotle found in Plato a guide and friend for whom he had the greatest admiration, and though in later years his own scientific interests tended to come much more to the fore, the metaphysical and religious teaching of Plato had a lasting influence upon him. Indeed, it was this side of Plato's teaching that would have a special value for Aristotle, as offsetting his own bent towards empirical studies. End quote. This then has been the what and the who. Let's consider now together the when and the where. Our answers to these questions can be quite brief. Copleston divides the accepted works of the Aristotelian corpus into 3 periods of Aristotle's life. He describes the first as the period of his intercourse with Plato, during which he still adhered closely to the thought of the latter. The second consists of the years of his activity at Assos and Mytilene. I think that's how you pronounce it. Mytilene. After Plato's death and after Aristotle had left the academy at Athens. Of this period, Copleston says that he, quote, began to diverge from his former predominantly Platonic position and to adopt a more critical attitude towards the teaching of the academy. He still looked on himself as an academician, apparently, but it is the period of criticism or of growing criticism in regard to Platonism. End quote. Finally, the third period consists of the time of his headship of the Lyceum at Athens, and it is, quote, in this period that there appears Aristotle the empirical observer and scientist, who is yet concerned to raise a sure philosophical building upon a firm foundation sunk deep in the earth. End quote. Copleston assigns the categories to this third and final period of Aristotle's life, but this, as with most aspects of the work, is heavily disputed, and it seems that most scholars would actually place it in the early period of Aristotle's time at the academy. If we were to follow Copleston, the date for the categories would be somewhere between 335 and 323 BC, the span of Aristotle's time at the Lyceum. If we follow the other scholars, its date would be sometime before 347, the year of Plato's death. Either way, its place of origin would be Athens, either at the academy or the Lyceum. Finally, we come to the why. We can consider this question under 2 aspects. First is the why in the sense of the purpose or aim of the categories as a work. Second is the why in the sense of the reason for reading and discussing the work in this podcast. Let's take these 2 aspects in turn. What was Aristotle's purpose or aim in the categories? There is no explicit statement within the text which gives us an answer to this question. Indeed, the text itself does not even seem to define its own subject matter. It is partly for these reasons that the Categories has historically perhaps been one of the most heavily debated philosophical texts, as I have mentioned already. Robin Smith refers to the doctrine of the 10 categories as perhaps the single most heavily discussed of all Aristotelian notions, about which interpreters are strongly divided. Paul Stutman similarly states concerning the same that experts disagree on many of its most important and fundamental aspects, and that there is wide divergence of expert opinion about even the most basic elements of Aristotle's Categories. Some of the major points of dispute concerning the Categories include its genre, its subject matter, its relationship to other works in the Organon, and to other works of Aristotle, and to Aristotle's thought in general. It has even been debated whether Aristotle is even the author. It seems pretty generally accepted at this point that it is in fact an authentic work of Aristotle, although it is thought that it may not originally have been intended as a single complete work, but may consist of parts or sections of different works or fragments from Aristotle, which a later editor compiled and combined under a single title. In any case, these factors should make clear why it is a quite difficult matter to answer our present question. What we can do, however, is refer to some of the traditional positions on such issues. As was stated near the beginning of this episode, the Categories was traditionally placed as the first work in the collection of Aristotle's logical treatises known as the Organon. Organon means instrument or tool or organ. The collection and title of these works as the Organon is not from Aristotle himself, but comes from later. As Robin Smith says, quote, "The title Organon reflects a much later controversy about whether logic is a part of philosophy, as the Stoics maintained, or merely a tool used by philosophy, as the later Peripatetics thought. Calling the logical works the instrument is a way of taking sides on this point." End quote. Although the collection is not from Aristotle himself, at least several of the works in the Organon probably really were intended to have some relation to each other, and one could perhaps make a case that the collection and organization of the Organon as a whole is at least fitting and useful. The 6 works contained in the Organon include the Categories, On Interpretation, the Prior and Posterior Analytics, the Topics, and On Sophistical Refutations. The placement of the Categories in the Organon at least tells us that this work was traditionally viewed as being about or related to the subject of logic. But what does that mean? As Robin Smith says, quote, "Aristotle has no word for logic as a whole, nor did he leave us a single comprehensive treatise on logic." End quote. Nevertheless, Aristotle does have a conception of a study or discipline which is what would come to be called logic. Indeed, Aristotle is appropriately known as the founder and discoverer of that discipline which we call logic, even if he did not give it that exact name. I stated earlier that for many of the fields in which he wrote, Aristotle's work would be both foundational and authoritative for centuries, and this is especially so with logic, where Aristotle reigned supreme until basically the 20th century. So Smith writes, quote, "Aristotle's logical works contain the earliest formal study of logic that we have. It is therefore all the more remarkable that together they comprise a highly developed logical theory, one that was able to command immense respect for many centuries. Kant, who was 10 times more distant from Aristotle than we are from him, even held that nothing significant had been added to Aristotle's views in the intervening 2 millennia." End quote. Indeed, Kant calls Aristotle the father of logic. Paolo Crivelli says, with even stronger language, quote, "Aristotle created logic and developed it to a level of great sophistication. There was nothing there before, and it took more than 2 millennia for something better to come around. The astonishment experienced by readers of the prior Analytics, the most important of Aristotle's works that present the discipline, is comparable to that of an explorer discovering a cathedral in a desert. But what could it possibly mean to say that someone created logic? Smith gives some explanation here. Quote, Aristotle claims a special kind of priority for his treatises on logic. In every other subject matter, he sees himself as continuing a line of work which began before him, and he presents his own theories as further developments of what he has received from his predecessors. When it came to the study of argument, however, Aristotle found himself in a different situation. End quote. Here he quotes Aristotle himself, who states, quote, when it comes to this subject, it is not the case that part had been worked out in advance and part had not. Instead, nothing existed at all. End quote. Then, Smith continues, quote, Aristotle does not mean that no one before him argued, or even that no one before him tried to teach how to argue. What he does claim, and we have no reason to dispute this, is that he was the first to conceive of a systematic treatment of correct inference itself. As such, Aristotle was the founder of logic. This makes the extent of his logical theories all the more remarkable. History's first logic has also been its most influential, with an unparalleled importance in post-Hellenistic philosophy, medieval Islamic philosophy, and especially medieval European thought. Indeed, for many generations of philosophers, Aristotelian logic was identically logic. Not until the 20th century was it finally supplanted as a result of the work of Frege and his successors. End quote. For Aristotle, logic is basically the study of argument and reasoning, especially the type of argument which he calls deduction, a translation of the Greek word syllogismos, from which we get our word syllogism. In the prior Analytics, perhaps his central logical work, Aristotle defines the deduction as, quote, a discourse in which, certain things being stated, something other than what is stated follows of necessity from their being so. I mean by the last phrase that it follows because of them, and by this that no further term is required from without in order to make the consequence necessary. End quote. Aristotle then recognizes two species of deduction, demonstration and dialectic. He says in the Topics, quote, a deduction is a demonstration when the premises from which the deduction starts are true and primitive, or are such as that our knowledge of them has originally come through premises which are primitive and true. And it is dialectical deduction if it reasons from reputable opinions. Things are true and primitive which are convincing on the strength not of anything else but of themselves. On the other hand, those opinions are reputable which are accepted by everyone, or by the majority, or by the wise. End quote. Smith then further explains, quote, demonstration is the principal subject of the posterior Analytics, while the Topics gives a method of use in dialectical argument. Other treatises are then closely connected with each of these. The prior Analytics describes itself as a preface to a theory of demonstration and has close ties with the posterior. Turning to dialectic, On Sophistical Refutations is an appendix to the Topics, ending with what is clearly intended as the final chapter of that work. On Interpretation gives a theory of the structure of propositions and their truth conditions, much of which is presupposed by the prior Analytics. End quote. This leaves then only the work of our own present interest, the categories, which, as Smith says, is more difficult to classify. Traditionally, as we have already said, the categories was placed as the first work in the Organon, followed by On Interpretation. Already, this placement gives us an indication of one ancient understanding of the function of the categories and its relation to the rest of the Organon, which understanding would become standard and authoritative in the West by way of Boethius, who himself receives it from the Neoplatonic schools. Giorgio Pini writes, quote, The Neoplatonic legacy was received in the 6th century by Boethius, who handed down to the Latin West the sequence, categories, on interpretation, analytics, together with the implicit systematic interpretation of Aristotle's work that had generated it." End quote. Pini then gives this very helpful quotation from Boethius. Quote, "Since Aristotle wanted to hand down to his successors the structure and the knowledge of both dialectical and demonstrative science, he realized that both the dialectical and the demonstrative argumentation was organized according to the same structure, i.e. syllogism. Thus he wrote the prior analytics, which the Greek call analutikon, so that the students should read them before they got any knowledge of either the dialectic or scientific discipline. But, since it is necessary that syllogism be made out of propositions, he wrote the book whose title is On Interpretation, on Propositions. But all propositions are made out of expressions signifying something. Consequently, he wrote the book that he wrote on the 10 categories, which in Greek are called the Kategoriae, is about the first names of things and their meanings." End quote. In short, Boethius's interpretation is that the structure of deduction is the syllogism. The syllogism is made up of propositions, and propositions are made up of simple expressions or names. As an example, let's take the following classic syllogism. Premise 1, humans are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a human. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is mortal. This syllogism is made up of 3 propositions, 2 of which are premises from which follow one conclusion. The statement, humans are mortal, is one of those propositions. This proposition in turn consists of 2 expressions, human and mortal. These expressions are simple expressions, i.e. they are not compound, unlike an expression such as fast horse, which is made up of 2 distinct elements, fast and horse. Now, on Boethius's view, the different distinct elements of the deduction or syllogism correspond to different works in the organon. The prior analytics corresponds to the syllogism as a whole. On interpretation corresponds to propositions, and the categories corresponds to simple expressions, which are the most basic elements of any syllogism. This, then, is the reason for the traditional Western ordering of the organon, with the categories first, followed by on interpretation, followed by the prior analytics. Before you understand the syllogism, you must understand propositions. Before you understand propositions, you must understand simple expressions. Accordingly, the categories was traditionally understood to be and used as a preface to all of logic. This was then, according to the standard traditional account in the Latin West, the function and aim of the categories. 2 things should be mentioned here before we move on. First, in the above description, I made use of Boethius's own language of simple expressions, which might seem to indicate that the subject of the categories is primarily words. But one of the ancient debates concerning the categories was precisely over whether its subject was words, concepts, or things. We will discuss this debate more when we come to the presentation of the 10 categories in the text itself. For now, it is just important to realize that this debate did not seriously alter the Western traditional understanding of the nature of the categories. Whether it was interpreted as being about simple words, simple concepts, or simple things, it was always about simple somethings, and always kept the same function and relation to the rest of the organon. Thus Pini writes, quote, "So it happened that the role of the categories as an introduction to the syllogism was regarded as an undisputed truth even in an age when the largest part of Aristotle's corpus was unknown to the Latin West. Admittedly, it was open to debate whether the categories dealt primarily with words or things. All the same, no one seems to have doubted that this writing was a treatment of simple elements, whether terms or things, to be read before on interpretation, which dealt with propositions. Consequently, no one seems to have seriously doubted that the categories belong to logic." End quote. The second thing which should be mentioned is that despite many challenges to the traditional account, it still seems to have been advocated by at least some relatively recent writers. One example which I might point out is in Sir David Ross, who, writing in the early 20th century, said, quote, "Aristotle's own name for this branch of knowledge, which would come to be called logic, or at least for the study of reasoning, is analytics. Primarily, this refers to the analysis of reasoning into the figures of syllogism, but we may perhaps extend it to include the analysis of the syllogism into propositions and of proposition into terms. The categories and on interpretation, which roughly speaking study the term and the proposition respectively, may be regarded as preliminary to the other logical treatises." End quote. But what are the challenges to the traditional Western account? Smith gives an overview of one. Quote, "An ancient tradition took the categories to be a preface to the whole of logic, giving a theory of the meaning of the terms of which propositions are composed. So interpreted, however, its latter half, chapters 10 to 15, makes no sense. Thus there is an equally ancient tradition which regarded this as spurious or out of place. But an even older tradition entitled it Prefatory Materials for the Topics, implying that the categories has something of the relationship to the dialectical treatises as on interpretation to the works on demonstration. On this basis, I am inclined to number the categories among the dialectical works." End quote. Unfortunately, there really is not any definitive conclusion we can arrive at here concerning these issues. And so to the first part of the why question, the question of the aim and purpose of the categories, we cannot give a definite answer. It does seem to me, from the little research I've done, that it is quite plausible that the categories is intended to bear some relation to the topics. On the other hand, as someone with scholastic attachments, I am of course partial to the traditional Western account. And then it is entirely possible that the categories as we have it was never meant to be a single work, but instead is merely a compilation of fragments which in themselves were entirely unrelated, but which were placed together by a later editor. It is important to keep all these possibilities in mind as we move forward and begin to examine the text itself. But now we reach the second aspect of the why question, which is the question of why we are reading and discussing this work. And the answer has pretty much already been given. I said at the very beginning of this episode that the Categories is one of the most fundamental works in all of philosophy. There are at least two reasons why this is so. One related to the work in itself, and the other related to Aristotle's doctrine of the 10 categories associated with the work. The first reason is simply that, correctly or incorrectly, the categories came to play the function of the preface to Aristotle's logic, and hence to logic simpliciter. Furthermore, since logic itself was often understood as the instrument of philosophy, logic was commonly studied prior to all philosophy and science. As such, the Categories was, for centuries, the very first work one studied when coming to philosophy. It was the introduction to all of philosophy. As such, the Categories played a role in shaping the entire course of Western philosophy. It is fitting, then, that it should be the very first text we examine in this podcast. The second reason has to do with the very idea of categories itself. Paul Studman writes, quote, "Aristotle's Categories is a singularly important work of philosophy. It not only presents the backbone of Aristotle's own philosophical theorizing, but has exerted an unparalleled influence on the systems of many of the greatest philosophers in the Western tradition. The set of doctrines in the Categories, which I will henceforth call categorialism, provides the framework of inquiry for a wide variety of Aristotle's philosophical investigations, ranging from his discussions of time and change in the physics to the science of being qua being in the metaphysics, and even extending to his rejection of Platonic ethics and the Nicomachean ethics. Looking beyond his own works, Aristotle's categorialism has engaged the attention of such diverse philosophers as Plotinus, Porphyry, Aquinas, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, Locke, Berkeley, Hume, Kant, Hegel, Brentano, and Heidegger, to mention just a few, who have variously embraced, defended, modified, or rejected its central contentions. All, and sorry, I accidentally activated my Google, who have all variously embraced, defended, modified, or rejected its central contentions. All, in their different ways, have thought it necessary to come to terms with features of Aristotle's categorical scheme. Plainly, the enterprise of categorialism inaugurated by Aristotle runs deep in the philosophical psyche." End quote. That was a long quote. For this reason, too, then, the Categories is a work of fundamental significance to philosophical study, and a work well worth our time and effort to consider. I hope that this introductory material has been helpful and interesting, and again, I apologize for not being able to get to the actual text in today's episode. I'll repeat what I said in the previous episode. This podcast is going to be a text-based podcast. The goal of the podcast is to dive into great and important text from the history of philosophy, theology, and science. So, rest assured, we will get to the actual text of the categories, and thank you for staying with me so far. My hope is that spending time in this episode to go over all the information we've been discussing will pay off and be fruitful when we actually begin reading next time. As of now, my plan is for the next episode to come out a week from today, so stay tuned. On a final note, if you enjoyed listening or are interested in the overall project of this podcast, please subscribe, review, and share with your family, friends, peers, coworkers, etc. This podcast is available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and SoundCloud, and I also post the episodes on YouTube. It would be especially helpful to me if you could subscribe, rate, and write a review on iTunes, as well as subscribe and like on YouTube. I'm starting out pretty small, but I'm excited to share this project, and I hope to grow and expand as I continue. So that's all for now, so until next time, thanks for listening.